All right, ready to rock and roll?
Yes, sir.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, alligators and crocodiles alike, welcome back to another brand new episode of The Outliers. My name is Ryan Allen. Unfortunately, my co-host Nick Allen is not here today. He is off wrestling crocodiles in the middle of the Gold Coast over in Australia and simultaneously fighting for the rights of emus down there. However, in his place, I do bring along someone that I think you will all find very interesting today. He is a petroleum engineer working off of the coast of Louisiana here in the good old USA. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Eric Rivera. Eric, thank you very much for joining the show.
Yeah, thanks for the nice intro, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And by petroleum engineer, if y'all can guess already, today's topic of conversation is on the oil drilling industry. We're going to be going over a bunch of different topics around it, like some of the basics that Eric experiences on a daily basis working on the rigs, some of the green energy questions that people may have in relation to oil drilling, and some of the political implications surrounding the oil industry that has been occurring for what, the last century or something like that, ever since
About, yeah.
yeah, ever since oil drilling got started. But let's start off with the basics, like I just said here a bit ago. So, petroleum engineer, what is that profession and what do you have to do to get into that?
Sure. So I'm a recent college grad. My bachelor was in petroleum engineering. I studied at University of Texas Permian, so I was
Mhm.
way out west. So what we do is we focus on the extraction of oil. So in the oil industry, we have three categories. We have upstream, midstream, and downstream.
Mhm.
So downstream is all the receivers of petroleum, right? So that's
Okay.
your gas stations, that's your refineries. Midstream is the transport of oil to those refineries. So pipelines, marine,
Mhm.
air, rail, right?
Okay.
And finally, what my degree focused on was in upstreams, finding, extracting, and most efficiently extracting that oil, right?
Mhm. So why is it that you decided to go for upstreaming as opposed to the mid and the down aspects of petroleum?
The industry, those are all great places to be. In my case, that's where I specialize. So most of my training was in drilling,
Mhm.
fracking, production, and reservoir engineering, right? So
Okay.
if I went to those other sides, I could, but this is where my education was focused.
Gotcha. And you want to be able to get the most out of your degree, just like every other, college student out there in America as well, correct?
You got it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So getting a 4-year degree specifically as a petroleum engineer to be able to get into that field, is there maybe other avenues that one has to take in order to get into this line of work, or is it you must have a 4-year degree from an accredited institute to even be considered as a possible candidate for being someone to work on these rigs?
Yeah, so you can, I mean, heck, there's people out of high school with barely a high school degree working
Mhm.
out on those rigs in West Texas, right? So you don't need a degree.
Mhm.
In fact, you can have, to do what I'm doing, you can have any engineering degree. You can be electrical and industrial, because I work in a service company.
Mhm.
But now there's less and less petroleum engineers every year, less and less people are going into it, but the demand for oil is increasing. So they've had to start dipping into mechanical engineers and electrical engineers to fill roles that used to be just us, like drilling engineers.
Interesting. And why is it that you think that the amount of drilling engineers is decreasing and you all are having to pull from different specialties of engineering in order to fill up these roles?
Mostly fear over the energy transition.
Mhm.
So, drilling engineers, the demand is pretty much like the rest of the industry, but petroleum engineers, that's typically where an operating company would hire uh, their talent from. But there just isn't enough of us anymore. People aren't going into it. It's a growing industry. It's actually doing quite well.
Mm.
The third world is coming out of poverty. We're going to need more and more oil than we ever have before over the next century. But people are scared by the rhetoric on the news that they see.
Okay. And we're going to touch into all that greenhouse energy stuff later on
Yeah,
here as the
sure.
interview goes along, but let's keep it focused on to like your particular job here and whatnot. So what are the benefits of being able to do petroleum engineering that you like that's opposed to maybe other job interests that you might have had in the past?
Sure. So like
Mhm.
I'm not from anywhere that has oil, but I wanted to study this specifically.
Yeah, from
Uh
good old Florida, USA, baby, straight
yeah,
from the
we don't got
source.
oil. It's flat and there ain't nothing underground. So
Yeah.
yeah, so first off, the job prospects are very good. Petroleum engineers are some of the highest paid engineers in the country. And then the diversity of work we can do is amazing. So you can design drill bits. You can work
Mhm.
in the field like I'm doing right now. You can do reservoir simulation, so you can have a more at home work from home environment.
Mhm.
You can work sales, and it's an interesting role in engineering. It's very practical. Our classes are very focused on what you do as an engineer.
Mhm.
So you're not going to be spending all the way till your junior year completely on theory. your sophomore, junior, you're going to start hitting drilling engineering. It's like, how do I be a drilling engineer? How do I design a well once you get to well design, things like
Hmm.
that. So yeah, as to why someone should study it, I think it's a good industry to go into. It's very useful. It's the reason you have clothes that are made with petroleum products. It's the reason your car works, right? So
Oh, that's interesting. So our clothes are made of petroleum products. It's not just we use it for other machinery that may need energy. I never knew that.
yeah, so as the refining industry took off in the 19th century, they needed to find more and more uses for this material because originally when they got it out of the ground, all we wanted was kerosene, right?
Hmm.
But Standard Oil, Dow Chemical, companies like that started finding different uses for these petroleum byproducts. So asphalt that goes into your road, your PPE, your personal protective equipment, gas masks, the artificial leather, any sort of synthetic basketball shorts you've ever worn, that was all thanks to the oil industry, including aspirin. There's so many things that come out of petroleum that go into making other things that make our lives easier.
And you wanted to be a part of the small population that gets all that stuff out from the Earth's crust to be able to, supply it to the majority of the world. Is that because you wanted to have that big of a contribution within the space, or is that more so just you found such a keen interest in wanting to be there on the ground doing the work?
So a few of the things why I went into it, right? It wasn't only just that the work is helpful, although that's important, right?
Mhm.
The pay is good, but more importantly to me was when I found out that a lot of the rhetoric we hear around the energy industry, this is before I ever went into the industry, was
Mhm.
fake. Florida's not going to flood next year, or I'm
Yeah.
not going to die in 5 years. So once I started finding out that climate change is not so humanogenic as we thought, I said, well, that's where I want to be. That makes people mad, and it also is pretty productive.
Yeah.
So
Lest we forget about the Mayan calendar as well, telling us we're gonna all die in 2012. That
that's
was
true.
that was some
They
what
probably
was
counted wrong. It's going to be next year. So.
oh no. I'm just getting started here, man. I can't have that happening. But in regards to working right there on the ground as well and being part of that big change, there is a big potential risk factor with working directly with all the drilling. What are some of the risks that someone in your position has to experience on a daily basis, whether that be potential like loss of life or just down to like maybe the more so like minute stuff like oh you may just like get a cut or something like that.
Yeah, so the majority of the industry, the majority of people working in this industry, they're labor. They work out in the field, and that's what I'm doing.
Mhm.
So you have to deal with high pressure environments, right?
Yeah.
So we're dealing with pressure differentials. Surface, you have 14 psi. That's one atmosphere, one bar, right?
Okay.
What we could have flowing through our surface lines could be 4,000, 10,000 pounds per square inch. That'll cut your car in half, right?
Mhm.
If there's a pinhole leak, that could really injure you. Also, we're
Mhm.
dealing with heavy equipment, right?
Yeah.
So a single drilling stand is 30 feet of near solid steel, right? It weighs a whole lot.
Yeah. You don't need that crushing your bones.
Yeah, back in the day, you'd go on a rig and you'd see a good third of the people be missing fingers, right? The industry's gotten a lot safer, which is the best thing about it.
So then, what are some of the safety practices or protocols that were put into place ever since all of that stuff was happening back in the day?
There's like an infinite number, but I could start with like an obvious one in drilling. We
Okay.
now have something called the iron roughneck. For the viewers, it'd be better to have a visual, but basically, you used to have to throw chain around the steel and tighten it together, torque it up to really high pressure just with your hands.
Cool.
Now they have equipment that'll catch that for you and tighten it right on the site. So we can use less people. It's a lot safer. PPE. So back in the day, you
Mhm.
just go out with your tank top and your jeans and on the drilling rig, and you'd be
Just
covered
going
in oil
for
by
it.
the end of the day.
Okay.
Now it's mandated that you wear fire-resistant clothing, right? So
Mhm.
if you do catch on fire, it doesn't melt to your skin. So another big one, we also have sulfur, so H2S coming out of the ground.
Mhm.
This exists naturally under the ground. When it escapes, it's extremely deadly. If you do start breathing in it at high enough concentrations, your smell can go away very quickly.
Mhm.
And your smell is one of the quickest ways to identify H2S. Well, now we wear H2S monitors, we have muster points, we've identified ways to make sure people don't die from this, probably the deadliest thing in the industry still. So, mind you, it's still not very deadly. The industry is very safe. You're probably more at risk being a pizza delivery driver than you are a roughneck every day. So,
Really?
yeah, you go to Martin Luther King Boulevard, man.
I guess I need to start tipping my delivery driver
Yeah,
more
tip your
then.
landlord, tip your delivery driver, bro.
Yep. All right then. Take me through the day to day. What is it that you do on a daily basis for, if I remember correctly, it's 2 weeks out of the month
I
for
it,
12 months?
it depends. I mean, what it depends on your company. So in my
Mhm.
case, I have a 3-in-1 schedule, so 2 weeks field, 1 week office. Well, okay, 3-1, 2-1-1, I guess you could say. So
Mhm.
2 weeks field, 1 week office, 1 week at home. So what I work in is something called coiled tubing.
Mhm.
They call it like the Swiss Army knife of the oil field.
Okay.
Because it can do anything, but basically it can deliver tools underground. So you can do logging inside the well to understand what's in the geology down there.
Mhm.
You can inject acid, right? So that can clear up debris inside the well bore. inside the reservoir. You can frack with coiled tubing. You can do cleanouts to remove debris from there. You can go fishing, which is when you drop a tool down the hole and you have to remove it.
And that's what you do
Cementing.
within a 14-hour day of work, correct? Or is there more so other things that you do outside of that during the workday?
So any one of those jobs could take 2 weeks, could take a month.
Oh, okay. So
So
this is all individual stuff that takes a long time.
yeah, it could take 10 hours. It depends on the job. So that's what my duty is. I'm a field engineer. So
Mhm.
I sort of supervise that role, learn the equipment.
And why is it that companies have that 3 week model to where they have people working for 2 solid weeks on like a rig out in the ocean and then 1 week off, if you know, behind the
Yeah.
instrument?
So there's a few reasons. For one, like I work offshore, so the cost of flying someone out to the middle of the Gulf of Mexico is pretty high.
Yeah.
So they don't want to be flying crews every 9 hours, right? So
Yeah.
they're going to fly you out for 2 week periods, right?
Mhm.
Another reason is that you're working in very remote locations. You're out in the Delaware Basin, somewhere out in West Texas, New Mexico. You're a good 2 hours from a nice city, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's by vehicle, right? So the nature of the work doesn't let you go home have a 9 to 5, right?
Mhm.
And 12 hours schedule is generally just because it's the ideal, crew rotation, half the day, half the day. You're
Mhm.
always working, right? The industry is very active.
So then what do you do on the rig when you're not working then? Because I imagine they're not just letting you like only sleep and whatnot. There's got to be some other things that you're able to do while you're actively on the job site 2 weeks, correct?
Yeah, it depends on what you're in, if you're in fracking or drilling, etc. But offshore accommodations are actually pretty nice. They have gyms. They have typically a catered kitchen. Some even have trainers offshore. On land, it's a completely different situation. You
Mhm.
might be staying in a hotel or a motel or in your truck sometimes.
And that difference between offshore and inshore, you're doing offshore. Is there a reason why you decided to do that as opposed to inshore, or is that not a choice that you had when initially going into this industry?
It's more or less not a choice in a lot of cases. In my case, I was looking for that. So
Hmm.
offshore in America is maybe 15% of our labor doing that. So it's a little bit more rigorous, a better start to a career, in my opinion. So that's where I was looking to go. I've worked on land in West Texas as well.
Hmm.
But yeah, there's less people doing it. Typically, the cost associated is 10 times higher, right? You have to imagine how much more expensive it is shipping something 20 miles by truck as opposed to like 70 miles by shipping container or by
Hmm.
helicopter. So everything, general rule of thumb, costs 10 times more. They need more experienced, better trained people. So that's where I was looking to go. I thought I'd get a better experience out there.
And that's a benefit that you probably want to be able to get when doing inshore work, or is that just
Yeah, they're both great. You're doing the same work, more or
Mhm.
less, but that's kind of what I was looking for. Also, the quality of life for me. I
Mhm.
don't have to be at home every night, so being offshore just seemed like a no-brainer.
If someone was to do inshoring work then as opposed to the offshore stuff, what are some of the things that one could expect in terms of like the job requirements? Because I imagine they're different from what you would do offshore with everything that you just mentioned right there. Or is all of it really the same across the board? One is just in the ocean and the other's just on land.
So the industry is really diverse. There's a lot of things you can be doing. You can be doing frac, in my case, coiled tubing. You can do
Mhm.
cementing. You can do drilling, right? So every job will be a little bit different. Generally, you're going to do more safety training going offshore. You're going to do offshore survival training. Might have a smaller crew. They might just do the cost of sending people out there, operate with a smaller crew. You're going to be a little bit more active, right? But
Mhm.
then if you're working in the North Sea, for example, that's a very heavy safety environment. So it's a completely different ballgame out there. They move much slower just because of the risks. Like everybody remembers Deepwater Horizon, the Macondo prospect, right?
Yeah, that
So
was also off of the Gulf of Mexico too, wasn't it? Yeah.
50 miles off the coast of Louisiana. So
Okay. Well, you're not working on that rig, are you though, right?
that rig no longer
Uh,
exists. So
yeah, that's right. It blew up. What am I saying? It's like I forgot to watch the movie or something like that. Okay.
yeah,
No, but one thing I wanted to point out there, you were mentioning a whole lot of the word fracking and then differing it from drilling.
yeah.
Like, so for the people at home that don't know, that like, what is the difference between fracking at an oil site as opposed to drilling?
So drilling is necessary every time you want to have a well. Fracking is an
Mhm.
addition. It might be better if we go through to sort of like how oil gets there, how we get out of the ground. You want to start at
Yeah,
the
sure,
beginning?
go for it, man.
When oil comes about, it's called petrogenesis. So we all know the idea, dinosaur, pressure, heat,
Yeah.
magic oil, right?
Yeah.
So people have a slight misconception about how that happens. So you have like source material, sort of like a sediment, and it's
Mhm.
not actually like big dinosaurs. Most of it, like the vast majority, at best plant material, but most of it was plankton, microbiotic life, right?
Right.
That was deposited over time. And once it's deposited, it goes through something called diagenesis. So it
Hmm.
becomes kerogen. Just high pressure, high heat sedimentary rock turns into kerogen.
Hmm.
And then you go through the process, thermal cracking or maturation, right?
Okay.
So that's the sort of magic where it goes from this unusual biotic material underground into petroleum.
And this is a process that takes potentially like years for it to go through to be able to turn into that product, or is it something that's naturally occurring on a daily
Yeah, it'll
basis?
be a pretty long wait time, about 150 million years. So
Oh,
yeah, petrogenesis is a very long process. So once you go to that maturation period, then it comes into migration. So it goes from your source rock. Now you have oil in a source rock, sometimes shale, and then it's going to travel upward over millions of years. Why is that? Because it's a lighter fluid
mhm.
surrounded by extremely heavy rock. You could be dealing with 2,000, 7,000 pounds per square inch down there. So over time, that liquid and gas, depending on the heat and pressure the kerogen was under,
Mhm.
that's the ratio of natural gas to oil you have down there. They're all hydrocarbons, right? So this is the
Okay.
broad category of hydrocarbon. That's coal, that's
Mhm.
oil, that's natural gas, methane, and a few other things.
So all the stuff that the typical populace expects for energy to be derived of in terms of fossil fuels.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So that's like that's your crude, that's your origin, right?
Mhm.
From there, it has to travel, right?
Yeah.
So, well, it more or less has to, just physics, right? It's going from high pressure zone to low pressure zone.
Mhm.
Now, it will actually continue to the surface eventually one day. And if you want to see what that looks like, look at Venezuela, right? They have
Mhm.
heavy oil coming straight out of the ground, or look at like the tar sands out in Canada, right? Alberta area, right?
I'm glad that you mentioned Venezuela because that is something that I do want to get into here, but we're going to save that for a little bit later. But
Yeah.
going back to the whole energy thing, all of these net hydrocarbons, they're all considered fossil fuels, meaning that they're essentially on a timer and
Yes.
whatnot. And because you just said right there, that entire process that it takes for all of these things to come up and be able to be utilized as energy takes 150 million years. So, because of how slow all of this is occurring and because of how fast the oil industry is working to be able to extract all of these, materials out of the ground, is there a cause for concern for there to one day be zero amounts of oil?
No oil left, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Peak
exactly.
oil, right? So that's a good question. So yes, it's a scarce resource. We can't make it tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
However, the question then becomes how efficiently do we utilize it and how much is left, right?
And I guess that would lead into more so the green energy stuff that's occurring here now in the modern era with people wanting to use air energy, solar energy, or like battery cars being more so utilized. Does it mean that we have to start reducing a lot more of our oil use and rely more heavily on those green energies? Or are we still good for the time being to be maintaining the consumption of oil that we're utilizing right now?
Well, first let's ask the question, what happens when oil becomes scarce? What
Mhm.
what will you as the consumer see? It's like any other consumer good, right?
Mhm.
You're going to have prices rise and consumers will change preferences. So as goods become more expensive, as petroleum becomes more scarce, if that in fact did happen one day,
Mhm.
because the question is consumption rate and availability, right? How much do we have? How much do we use? That's the essential question. And we're nowhere near, frankly, running out right now.
Okay.
But first, what the consumer would see is the prices would steadily rise.
Mhm.
Heavy industry would look for alternatives, right? This is just sort of how the market functions. The ingenuity of man is immense. So actually, it wouldn't be this catastrophe that would appear tomorrow. You wouldn't wake up one day and your car wouldn't work. You'd see oil prices steadily rise until we found an alternative. So that's how
Mhm.
free people operate in a free society. They look for alternatives based on prices. They maximize their own economic potential, right? So it wouldn't be a shock. There's no reason to believe that the end of the oil industry, if that indeed happen due to peak oil, would be a shock. What would happen
Mhm.
is it would be tough. Think of like the 80s, right, when the Middle East was embargoing the United States,
Yeah,
right?
and everyone had like a certain allowance of gas that they were able to get from the gas station.
Yeah, rationing, all of that. That's not an effective way to manage a scarce resource. I'd recommend you look into some Austrian economics or something like that. You can see the best way to handle this is just let people choose themselves what they want, and the market will find alternatives. But
Mhm.
let's go back a little bit. In my opinion, there would be no problem if oil did start to become scarce. It would be a steady process, and the market forces themselves could find alternatives like we've already been doing
Mhm.
without regulation, without rationing, and without subsidy. People would be
Mhm.
able to do that freely on their own. But the
Okay.
question of are we running out of oil? Funny thing is, you can look up articles and find articles from the 1890s discussing running out of oil. You can find people like Thomas Malthus predicting we're going to run out of food one day, right? By the
Yeah.
1920s. So
1920s are a far cry away from the 2020s right now, too.
yes, yeah. So in peak oil is a cry that we've heard for a very long time, and it turns
Mhm.
out to have been absolutely not true. Why is that though? When you do just a simple XY plot of how much oil we consume and how much there is,
Mhm.
it's like, my God, we should have ran out 70 years ago, 500 years ago. I mean, whatever
Mhm.
resource you want to pick. The reason why is humans are ingenious in the way they utilize resources. They find ways to use them more efficiently.
Mhm.
Your refrigerator in the 50s is like 20 times less efficient, maybe, okay, more like 5 times less efficient than your modern refrigerator,
Yeah.
right? Also, our extraction techniques. Back in the day, when we get oil out of the ground, we might get 10% of the oil, original oil in place. It's called our recovery efficiency out of the ground.
Mhm.
Now, in some reserves, we can get 70%. But more importantly, there's another aspect of this as well.
Mhm.
So, what we know exists, we are able to extract more efficiently. What we
Mhm.
have, we're able to use more efficiently. Car fuel efficiency has increased massively outside of government incentives, just due to market efficiency. Our combustion engines are so much more efficient than they used to be. And then finally, our ability to find that oil. So our surveying techniques have dramatically increased, right? We have
Mhm.
seismic surveys, we have magnetic surveys, we have graviometric surveys, right? So we've
Mhm.
actually found more oil year over year that we didn't know exist. Mozambique, off the coast of Angola, West Africa,
Mhm.
Guyana is a big one now. West Texas. West Texas is a great example. I'll get to in a second.
Yeah.
But we find more. We also find out stuff that we knew existed that we thought was impossible to touch is now touchable. So I think that's a good example to go into fracking. It might be better if we start a little bit earlier back at how you get oil out of the ground. Would you want to start there or you want to
Yeah,
skip just
let's
straight to
start right
fracking?
there. Like, what's the process to be able to find all those oil wells so that you're able to then go into the whole fracking process
Sure.
and extract all of that right there? Because I imagine it's not as simple as just like you walk around somewhere, you stick a point in the ground, and you're like, okay, let's test this out right here, see if we could get oil right here. Like, there's got to be a better process of doing that, right?
Yes. So back in the day, it was, do I see oil on the ground? Cool. There's probably oil under there. Let's go drilling, right? And they take a big stick and drop it like 5,000 times, and eventually the well would be like 20 feet deep. So we've advanced a lot further than that. We started off with rotary table drillings. Then
Mhm.
we invented the basic drilling techniques. So casing, cementing, etc. Rather than going through the whole history, let's just start with like how we do it now. Let's say you don't know oil is there, but you think it is, right? So you go
Yeah.
surveying. Typically, we use seismic surveying. So back in the day, you set off explosives and you have geophones set in places, and you pick up the reverberations of the sound waves, and it tells
Mhm.
you what's under the ground.
Okay. That
Um,
sounds very inefficient too, though. The utilization of explosives
yeah,
to be able to
we don't
find
really
something.
do that anymore.
Yeah, I'm glad y'all don't because that sounds like a very good way for someone to be losing a lot more than just a limb, just
So
oil.
we found cheaper ways. Actually, the story about seismic surveying was really fun. Back in well, okay, it's not fun at all. It's actually kind of tragic.
So
Um,
fun that there were so many people dying to find oil. It's amazing. No, I'm kidding.
Well, the origin of this was weird. So there was
Mhm.
a German, I think, physicist of some sort back in World War, peak of like the Verdun conflict, and the guy found out that by setting up something called geophones along the front lines, you can triangulate the position of artillery.
What are geophones? I've never heard of that concept before.
So it's a microphone that faces towards the ground
Mhm.
and picks up vibrations of the ground.
Oh, so it's able to hear the movement of the tectonic plates underneath in relation to all
Um,
the kerosene that's underneath the ground,
I
or
think that's a little bit too advanced. Maybe that's a possible, I don't know. But in this case, it's just vibrations, right?
mm,
So what happens when heavy artillery fires? It sends reverberations to the ground. So
okay.
the Germans figured out by setting up geophones along the front line, three of them, you could triangulate the position of artillery just by measuring when the sound waves travel from the firing point to the front line. So by using these three phones, they
Mhm.
could just use some simple algebra and figure out the precise location of the enemy artillery and counter battery fire.
They were
That's
able to use that same concept to be able to go forward and find oil now. Well,
yeah, it was kind of ridiculous. So that guy was like, "Okay, we're over. I want money." So he went to the United States, I believe it was the States,
yeah.
and found a way to develop this geophone technology into detecting reverberations of sound waves when you fire explosives on surface, right?
Mm,
So that was the origin of it. Different rocks have different refracting properties. So the sound waves will refract at different angles, and the sound waves will travel back to you at different speeds based on what it hits. So that's how you can model what's underground.
okay.
Today, we use something called vibrators. It's very simple, just a big stick that hits the ground.
Okay.
Yeah. Uh,
Just a big stick that hits the ground and you find oil. The ingenuity of man,
See,
seemingly.
exactly, magic. You have a
Uh,
whole lot of other stuff you can use, gravimetric, electromagnetic, but I just focus on the main one that we use, which
mhm,
is just seismic surveying. So from there, let's say we found the oil reserve. We've
mhm,
done our reservoir description. We've inputted our data from our geophones.
mhm,
Now we've decided on a place to drill. So the drilling process is pretty straightforward. You rig up, you set up your drilling rig.
mhm,
You select your drill bit based on the rock you expect to go through. And then you have your drilling location. So we start drilling into the ground, right? The drill bit goes in. On
mhm.
top of the drill bit is your drill string. Your drill string is made up of large, mostly inflexible joints called stands.
Mhm.
And as you go deeper into the well, you stack another stand on top of that previous stand, and you just keep going and going. And that's what roughnecks do. They put together those
Yeah.
stands on top of your string. Oh, also, while you're drilling, you have all this debris you're creating, right?
Yeah.
What do you do with that debris?
You're gonna have to put it somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you get it out of the hole? What we do is we inject fluid through the center of the drill string and it flows up the outside of the drill string called the annulus. That's what removes our cuttings. And what kind of fluid do we use? It's called drilling mud. That's where mud engineering comes in. So you design your mud based on what sort of natural reservoirs you encounter.
Okay, so it's like a different combination that occurs every single time then because of the particular environment that
You
you're
got it.
drilling into. Okay, gotcha,
Yeah. So
gotcha.
there's people that dedicate their whole career to this somehow. It's not particularly exciting, but it's something that we all need to know how to do or know a little bit about.
Mhm,
So that drilling fluid, main purpose, removing the cuttings. Second purpose, cool the drill bit, right?
mhm,
Third purpose, the weight of the hydrostatic column prevents kicks. And we might get into that. It's a little bit more complex for what we need. So
mhm,
once you've gotten to your desired height, you can pull out a hole, and then you take a big metal casing and you put it into the hole. You
yeah,
hang it and then you inject cement through the center of the casing
mhm,
until it gets to the bottom of the hole. It travels up the outside of the casing and now
mhm.
fills the walls of the well, connecting the casing to the ground. And this prevents communication. This keeps your well safe, prevents you from contaminating groundwater as well.
And then with the cuttings that you were mentioning earlier too, obviously you have to do something with them outside just like collecting them with the mud that you were talking about. What is it that y'all do in order to properly discard all these cuttings?
So we actually recycle our drilling mud. So it goes to this thing called a shell shaker, and those cuttings are picked up there.
Mhm,
Sometimes the cuttings can be reused by a mud engineer to increase the density of the fluid if you mix it in. As far as my understanding, I'm not so much on that drilling side of things,
mhm,
but that's what we do with the cuttings, remove from the ground. It's not a particularly large content of cuttings, like your large on land, maybe 12-inch diameter hole
mhm,
going for like 700 feet. Then you'll have a 7-inch diameter hole going for another like 2 miles, right? So you drill, pull out a hole, put in casing,
yeah,
cement casing, continue drilling down.
mhm,
So you're going to have like a very long vertical section.
mhm,
It could be 500 feet in some rare cases nowadays, or it could be 2 mile vertical section. And the outside section will be casing. Then you're going to hang off an inner casing inside of it. So you could visualize it as like an ice cream cone,
mhm,
right? Conically shaped, just layer upon layer. And these layers protect the local water table. So how is it that we prevent environmental destruction?
mhm,
One of the ways we do that is our very rigorous casing design and
yeah,
cementing. So this way, whatever fluid we get from 2 miles under your feet to surface
mhm.
doesn't interfere with the water table, and whatever fluid we put downhole doesn't interfere with the water table either. By cementing around the casing, that prevents fluid from migrating to surface outside of the well we just drilled.
Okay. And the farthest that you guys will cut down into would be like the middle of the Earth's crust, if I remember correctly.
That's kind of right. Yeah.
Right.
So the crust is like 20 miles to 3 miles in depth on average. There's deeper and shallower sections, three
Mhm,
miles like offshore ocean. In my case right now, that's what I'm doing. Most everything is in the crust. You go to the mantle, things get too hot, destroys hydrocarbons.
mhm,
Another important factor is we don't have the technology right now to economically get down there. I'm sure if you really tried, like the Soviets did with their super borehole project, you could get pretty deep. I think the Chinese are doing a really deep well that they're advertising somewhere in like Ningbo, China or something.
mhm,
The whole thing about the oil industry is it's economic. We theoretically maybe could go deeper than the crust.
mhm,
It's just there's no reason to, and it's questionable whether or not there would be hydrocarbons down there anyway.
mhm.
Certainly deep in the mantle, there's nothing. There's nothing that could exist down there. It's too hot, right?
Yeah, because that's just a whole lot of magma in the Earth's core leading over to. So
Yeah.
throughout that whole process right there, like it sounds like y'all got all your bases covered in terms of making sure this process is as environmentally friendly as it possibly can be. So then I guess that calls into the question, why
Yeah.
is it that people are so concerned about oil drilling potentially causing upticks in global warming over the last, like 30, 40 years.
So that has to do with carbon emissions. Everything we're doing now is to help the actual environment. Carbon emissions have to do with the burning of fossil fuels,
Mhm.
right? So that's like something on the downstream side of things. So that's a question for like later. It's not really relevant to like this. I guess the only thing on the operation side upstream is something called flaring, but that might have to do with carbon emissions. I mean, obviously it does, but it's not a major component of carbon emissions.
Mhm. What is flaring, by the way?
So when we have excess natural gas on surface
Mhm.
than we predicted, instead of releasing this methane into the atmosphere, methane, by the way, is a heavy greenhouse gas, right? It's far better at trapping heat. We burn it and convert it into carbon dioxide. Also, it's methane is noxious. If you breathe it in, it can kill livestock or people. So
Yeah.
we're going to burn it. Those are those large flares you see out in the desert, right?
Okay. Gotcha, gotcha.
I guess I can rush through the drilling thing. So pretty much you get to total vertical depth, then you can select your direction of drilling, right? So
Mhm.
now we have a technology called horizontal drilling. So we can change the direction of this drill bit.
Horizontal drilling. But is there like a certain depth where there's a better chance of horizontal drilling being absolutely effective?
I'm sure there's a depth that we could go to that it wouldn't work, but no, you can kind of have it work anywhere. I've seen it work at like a mile and a half under the ground. Also, you could theoretically just drill a big U in the ground and have it come back out on surface. That's happened by accident sometimes.
By accident? How the heck do you get that to happen by accident?
You know, I don't exactly know. I've just seen an image of it in a textbook, but apparently somebody did it. So you have a good directional driller, plan things in advance. But
Yeah. So then how is it that you do horizontal drilling then? Because the bits and pieces that y'all use are to go vertically into the ground and not horizontally. Is there stuff inside of the drill that then extends out as y'all are going down?
kind of. So there's a lot of different tech you can use to turn a drill bit underground. One is a form of jetting. So if the rock underground can be made softer by directing fluid into it, it can make the rock in one direction softer, causing the drill bit to lean in that direction. There's another way you can set a deflection tool at the bottom of a well. So once you've drilled the well, set an angle and it just sort of follows that angle once it runs into it. That's a very simple method.
Okay.
But more interestingly now, there are these flaps on the sides of the drill bit. And as the drill bit is spinning, for the audience, you can imagine a long pipe, and in the horizontal direction, there's these flaps that fold out along the axis. Is that Ryan can see what I'm
Yeah,
describing
yeah,
here.
I know what you're talking about here.
And
So,
those flaps will open at a certain position as the drill bit is spinning, and they will open as you're rotating only in one direction, causing the drill bit to naturally lean one direction,
got
right?
it. So for the audience, think about that long pipe that Eric was thinking about and like the flaps on an airplane that you would see when they're going to break whenever they touch down at the airport. That's kind of like the visual that I'm getting right there.
Yeah, you got it. And the flaps would be oriented in, you think of a plane landing, right? You have your ailerons and they flap up and down, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So instead of the wing flying forward, imagine those flaps oriented as if the wing went sideways, right? So they're not opening
Mhm.
forward. That's too much drag, right? They open sideways.
Yeah.
But yeah, opening and closing extremely quickly, that's going to cause the bit to lean in one direction.
Mhm.
And over a few hundred feet, you can get it going in the exact direction you want it to go.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
now the reason we do that is to increase the contact area with the reservoir. So
Mhm.
reservoirs are typically organized horizontally just because that's how the earth is layered, right?
Mhm.
So you drill that mile and a half vertically, right?
Yeah.
There's no oil in there. The only purpose of that mile and a half vertical section is get to that 150-foot vertical section of oil. But although it's maybe 50 feet vertically, it could be 2 miles horizontally. So by drilling horizontally through that, you can have a higher contact area and get more oil out of the ground. And
Mhm.
this is where fracking comes into play. So you drill the well, and now what do you have? You have this long metal tube surrounded by cement
Mhm.
that has no communication with the reservoir. So what do you need to do? You need a communication method. Traditionally, you're going to cement encase the whole thing. There's exceptions, but we're going to focus on the traditional method.
Mhm.
You insert perforating guns. So these are shaped charges like you use to destroy tanks, right? So
Oh, dude, y'all are using stuff to destroy tanks down there. All right.
well, the same tech. So it's like
Mhm.
a angled metal sheath, extreme heat. It inverts and creates a teardrop shape that goes into the well bore. It only
Mhm.
goes a few feet. The only purpose of that is to make it so there's a hole between the casing and the reservoir. You can also use jetting, which is just high pressure directed water. So powerful, it's able to make a hole in the steel and the concrete, go into the reservoir. That's the next step. That's in the completions department typically.
Mhm.
So your drilling guys, they've left like last week, right? So your well's done.
Got it. You're
You
on to week two now of
yeah.
everything.
Yeah, it might have taken them 3 months to do that. Might have taken them 2 weeks, depends on the well.
and time frame difference that has to do with more so the rock that y'all are drilling into to be able to get to those oil wells.
Yeah, it could be the amount of accidents you had. And by
Oh,
accidents, I don't mean like something terrible happening. I just mean like
I would
some
hope
piece of
not.
equipment didn't function, so you have to wait for the new equipment to get there, right?
Who are typically the suppliers of all this new equipment, or
Sure.
is it more so within the company that one would work for?
So there's like a division in the oil industry. There's the operators and the service companies. Operator is the guy that wants the well drilled. He owns the land. He owns the oil. The service company is the guy that gets it done. So sometimes the operators will own that equipment. Pretty rare though. Nowadays, it's just more efficient to let somebody else do it. So if you have a drilling company out there like Neighbors, right? If
Mhm.
something breaks on their end, they probably have a whole fleet of replacements, right?
Okay.
And if they don't, they know who to call to get a replacement for that.
So when those replacements take time to be able to acquire, what is it that y'all do between the time that the piece breaks up to the time that you get the replacement for it? Because I imagine you can't just like not do work during that time, correct?
That's more or less true. Yeah, I mean, there's some times where there's no work to do, but like in frac, let's say a pump goes down, the wireline guys are just sitting there. So what are they going to do? They can do inventory, they can do maintenance. The frac guys, while they're waiting for one part in a pump, they may go and do maintenance on the others, replace the valves and seats, right?
Mhm.
So pretty much you do maintenance. And if you're with some companies and there's nothing to do, like you're the guy that just brought the drill bit there and somebody else does everything,
Mhm.
aside from checking the inventories there, you just sit pretty in your truck waiting, you know?
So there could be a whole lot of like waiting pieces to this entire like oil industry thing as opposed to just
Yeah,
working 24/7 in 2 weeks out of every single month
you
for
got
the
it.
entire time.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So let's switch gears a little bit and get back
Sure.
more into like the green energy stuff. You mentioned like the entire process and it being environmentally friendly to such a important extent where it could be hard for environmentalists to potentially argue the effects, if you will, of what drilling does to the globe in terms of like global warming or damaging the outside environment and what have you.
Mhm.
To what extent is there an expectation to how much of the environment may get potentially restructured or potentially destroyed with every single area or well that needs to be drilled into and completely change?
Sure. So there's like a lot of different categories by which you can measure environmental impact. The main concern with hydrocarbons is climate change, right?
Yeah.
That's not really related to whether or not the water table's polluted and stuff, but
Mhm.
the individual well, it's actually pretty non-invasive. So
Mhm.
the well, you just need a pad. It could be, let's say 500 by 500 feet. It could be smaller, it could be larger,
Mhm.
depending on what the company needs. And that's just for the drilling process. Once the well is completed, it took very little steel, took very little cement. This well bore could be 5 inches in inner diameter, 10 inches outer diameter. It's not particularly a lot of material. And then you have some surface facilities. So you might have a pipeline, you're going to have storage tanks, you're going to have separators.
Mhm.
But all of that, when the well is done, can be really well hidden. A wellhead can be like, 3 feet if you set it right. You could set it under the ground and hide it. So, I mean, the end of the day, environmental impact on the local area is almost nil. Like,
Mhm.
unlike a solar panel field, it's not going to be visible from a plane if you don't want it to be. A lot of companies will just leave the pad there. It's a clean, empty field. You could start growing trees on that. You could surround it with trees. Nobody would ever see it. So, in terms of the local environment, there's little to no impact. We've really got it down to a science. If you do cementing incorrectly, if something can escape around the outside of the wellbore
Mhm.
into a water table, that could cause troubles. But that's the water table is really the only concern, and we've been really handling that well. Water tables aren't really corrupted anymore, especially in the States. We're very rigorous. So.
Mhm. Okay, gotcha.
There's other topics we could discuss regarding climate change, but also we have to frame things correctly, right?
Mhm.
Environmental damage. How do you compare that to someone having the ability to have electricity in their home, right?
Mhm.
First off, the damage is near nil. But second, everything has a cost. You build an electric car,
Mhm.
you build a road, you build your home, those resources came from somewhere.
Mhm.
So we're not comparing it to nil. We're not comparing it to no environmental damage. We're
Mhm.
comparing the cost of an oil well to the cost of a solar panel or
Okay.
a fleet of solar panels. And when it comes down to energy production, the oil wells required far less natural resources to produce
Mhm.
as opposed to those other industries. Those other industries are less developed. They require a lot of rare earth minerals and they require a lot of space. Strip mining is far more invasive than an oil well, which I could literally hide one and it could be producing Let's say like 3,000. Okay, that's kind of high, but it
3,000 gallons of oil every
no,
second.
barrels. A barrel is 42 gallons. So there are some wells that can do that. But let's
Mhm.
say on land, like reasonably in its first year out in West Texas, could be producing 1,000 barrels a day for like a month, right? You could theoretically hide that pretty easily, right? You
Okay.
just set up some trees, paint over the facilities like you see in Cali. They can hide that stuff pretty well.
Yeah.
There's oil wells inside Los Angeles city limits somehow, and people don't notice.
Really?
Yeah. My friend went to school in LA
Hmm.
and they had a operating horse jack, which is artificial lift device. You know,
Hmm.
you've seen them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like
Um,
it's like similar to what it looks like the churned butter, basically.
Kind of,
It's a bit of
yeah.
a device.
He had one of those like at the entrance to his school. So I mean, they're not invasive. The road that's outside of your house is more invasive than a single oil well because the well is, as I mentioned, it could be 3 by 3 feet in the ground at
Hmm.
most, like depending on what the wellhead is. And then you need the storage and transport facilities, which the
Hmm.
transport facilities could be somewhere else. They could be next to the well, and the pipeline could be hidden underground. So it's a pretty non-visually invasive thing, and in terms of the local environment, there's not much cost either. Most people's main qualm with the oil industry is carbon emissions. In my opinion, the science is extremely biased. There's not much fair. This is more like a clergy than it is actually an analysis, right,
Hmm.
of what is true. First, I'd like to point out that all of our estimates of future temperatures based on modeling that assumes that carbon dioxide is the major warming element
Hmm.
or is the major cause of change in temperature. The major warming element is always going to be the sun. All of these models dramatically overestimate future temperatures.
Hmm.
There's not a one that's below the actual mark.
Hmm.
So then that asks the question, why is that? And the answer is that they're overestimating the impact of this minor greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide,
Hmm.
on warming. What are the other possible explanations for why this isn't true? Like, listen, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It does, in fact, trap
Hmm.
heat. That's not in question.
Yeah.
The question is to what extent? And that's something that we can't actually answer right now.
Hmm.
The climate is a very hard thing to model. You have many variables at play. You have cloud coverage, right? You have aerosols. What impact do they have
Hmm.
upon cooling the earth? Then you have a turbulent fluid system, right? We cannot accurately predict that. Why is it that sunspots happen? We're not exactly able to answer. It's just constant change, right? So these are things that we're not able to accurately predict per models, right?
Hmm.
This is more likely, in my opinion, the end of an ice age if it in fact is warming. We've been in a pretty cold period the past about 400 or 500 years, and the Earth has dramatically changed. No one would argue that this is the warmest period in Earth's history. There have been far warmer. There have been periods with higher carbon dioxide concentrations. And I think an important thing to point out as well
Hmm.
is they always talk about carbon dioxide being correlated with global warming, right? With
Yeah.
humanogenic climate change, with the changes in the Earth's temperature. But they never point out that these same Arctic ice core samples show that the carbon dioxide concentrations occurred after the warming period. What does that indicate? The carbon dioxide is not the causal factor,
Hmm.
right?
And I like that you're mentioning this too in regards to the carbon dioxide, because we can even take a look at our atmosphere as to what it is right now in comparison to like a millennia ago. It's been reported that the oxygen to carbon dioxide ratio has always been 1 to 4, which, I mean, it begs into question, how could carbon dioxide be the reason for climate change and global warming happening?
So I think the primary question is, do humans have an impact on the climate, and is that impact notable and measurable?
Hmm.
And I'll actually cite the IPCC. I think it was their 2020, and for anyone that doesn't know, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, ran through the United Nations. It's more or less known as the guys to go to on climate change. And if you do listen to them, if you can read them, read Working Group 1. Working Group 1 is the
Hmm.
research arm of IPCC. They're the ones that do the real stuff.
Hmm.
I say real in quotations, but even they, who are pretty much the most severe climate warriors aside from a French fella in Greenpeace,
Hmm.
they will tell you that the climate has been warming since about the 1860s. Um, However, the amount of human contributed carbon dioxide to make an effect on the climate was at the earliest the mid 1940s. So, how on earth, if this warming is entirely human made, right?
Hmm.
And mind you, you can look at the graphs of warming. It's not a tremendous uptick in 1940, right? How on earth is it warming when the amount of carbon dioxide, if it's all human-made carbon dioxide that's causing the warming, before the period when humans could have had an impact on the climate, according to the IPCC.
Hmm.
Look at their 2022 report. I'd recommend you look up a speech as well. Dr. Robert Murphy with the Mises Institute did a quick talk on this. I think it was about a year ago. And he
Hmm.
just goes through the report. He's like, okay, let's listen to the clergy on what they believe about this. What do they say in their own literature? And their own literature does away with their own hysteria. So, in my opinion, even when you listen to the main voices in this matter,
Hmm.
right, the IPCC's Working Group 1, the effects of climate change are minimal. They also will tell you we don't have a say in it. If you do away with oil, you will actually have far worse ability to respond to a changing climate. The abilities that we have through cheap energy are immense. You
Hmm.
have helicopters, you have a functional hospital, you can run incubators. When energy gets too expensive in Africa and Southeast Asia, what
Hmm.
happens? Those things turn off, people die. So here in the West, we see it as a luxury. Oh, a luxury belief. I can turn off. I drive an electric car, right?
Yeah.
But in Angola, that's not an option. Like
No. You still
the
got
a
right, Camel.
a few pennies difference in the WTI means that you don't feed your family, means that one of your kids dies, right? So this is something that really angers me because people are actually being harmed by bad science, by
Hmm.
falsehoods. And listen, I'm not a climate scientist in any way, shape, or form. I just think that because I'm in this industry, I have a responsibility to know about these things. So I'm trying to learn
Hmm.
as much as I can. In that sense, I'd recommend you look at the EIKE. It's the European Institute of Climate Exchange, I believe it's called. They
Hmm.
do a lot of great speakers with climate scientists that do not agree with the narrative. Another one is Richard Lindzen. He's a famous climate scientist, one of the first back in the 80s. I
Hmm.
believe he came up with the iris theory, which apparently isn't accepted anymore. But he is one of the forefathers in this field, and he completely rejects this whole thing. The thing is, there's a whole lot of state funding towards a certain narrative, and if you have the wrong narrative, you don't get funded. If you have the wrong narrative, you get kicked out. And if your summary says the wrong thing, you're out. Your data can say one thing, but the
Hmm.
summary and the parts that the general public read cannot contradict the narrative that climate change is real, man-made, and serious, right? So I just don't think it is.
Hello there, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Outliers podcast. Sorry to abruptly come in here and to put a stop to the episode, but unfortunately, that is all that we have for the interview that I did with Eric. There was an entire second half of this interview that we did that we were going to separate into a part one and part two episode, but when I pulled the audio file for the recording, there was just the entire second half that was overwhelmingly corrupted and just not usable at all, not able to be edited, and certainly not able to be listened to even without edits being done to it. So there's an entire second half of that interview that I did with him that is just lost to the digital cyberspace abyss. However, that being said, though, that doesn't mean it won't be the last that you ever hear from Eric Rivera on the topic of the oil industry. We do have plans to be able to have him come back on future episodes of the podcast and to talk about more things pertaining to the industry and to also potentially talk about a multitude of other topics that don't even pertain to the industry that he works in. Eric is actually a very knowledgeable individual on a variety of subjects outside of his scope of practice, and I know that a lot of you listening here would be very interested to hear what he has to say on a variety of different subject matters that we are going to be going over in the coming weeks and months here. But until then, this has been Ryan Allen. Thank you very much for tuning in to another episode of the Outliers podcast. And I hope you all have a very fantastic day. All right. Take care, everyone. Ciao.